Welcome to Module 6. This module provides a detailed look at screening and recruitment for the GRAND pivotal clinical trial. By completion of this learning module, you will be able to list inclusion and exclusion criteria for participant candidacy, identify 4 strategies for participant recruitment, articulate the differences between pre-screening and GRAND study screening, understand the 2-tiered consent process, and describe the candidate confirmation process. The ideal GRAND study participant is age 16 or older, has a cervical level spinal cord injury C1 to C7, AIS A, B, or C, with retained shoulder and elbow flexion function, but loss of function in the forearm and hand. Candidates are at least 6 months post-injury and demonstrate neurologic stability. They should be completely healed and stable following any voluntary tendon or nerve transfers. It is critical to have intact innervation in the paralyzed muscles of the forearm and hand, demonstrated by grade 3 out of 5 strength in response to stimulation in the key muscles listed here. Candidates should be medically stable, have a desire for greater independence, and be able to understand and provide informed consent. Not everyone with a cervical spinal cord injury is a candidate for the NNP. There are a number of conditions that exclude persons with SCI from participation in the GRAND trial, such as other neurological conditions, injuries or conditions that compromise the peripheral nerve, progressive spinal cord injury, coexisting spinal pathology, such as a syrinx or unstable spinal segment, other active implantable medical devices, history of cardiopulmonary disease, poorly controlled autonomic dysreflexia, or unhealed fractures that interfere with use of the arm and hand. Additional exclusions include significant upper extremity denervation, ventilator dependency, a disorder or condition that requires MRI monitoring, and concurrent involvement in other clinical trials. Certain conditions, such as active infections, pressure injuries, respiratory illness, or pregnancy, temporarily exclude participants until the condition is resolved. Finally, the PI has discretion to exclude participants based on other medical findings or conditions that preclude safe participation in the trial. Now that you have an idea of who is potentially appropriate for the GRAND trial, here are just a few sources and strategies for participant recruitment. You may already have research or clinical registries that contain information about people with SCI. Those would be a great place to start. Participants may also be recruited from the medical practices of the site PIs and fellow SCI practitioners, outpatient occupational and physical therapy clinics, as well as other outpatient clinics such as those for wheelchairs and seating or upper limb interventions. Also, don't forget to reach out to local SCI consumer advocacy or support groups. Posting flyers, direct mailings, and presentations and ads on institutional social media accounts are all great strategies for recruitment. We here in Cleveland can provide materials to help you get started. However, remember that all materials and strategies require approval by the IRB. Module 5 provided an overview of the GRAND study, including the participants' timeline. Remember that prior to enrollment in the GRAND trial, participants who are candidates for voluntary reconstructive procedures, such as tendon transfers or nerve transfers, are referred to the appropriate clinical reconstructive surgery program. This makes our screening and enrollment procedures a little different from other clinical trials. As you recruit participants for the GRAND trial, you will likely be evaluating people at various stages post-SCI. Let's walk through how evaluations will look for prospective participants, depending on whether or not they have already had voluntary reconstructive procedures, such as tendon or nerve transfers. For the purposes of the GRAND trial, we will use the terms pre-screening and screening to define different stages of the evaluation process. Pre-screening can be thought of as a precursor to participation in the GRAND study. Pre-screening refers to clinical evaluation activities that determine if a participant is a candidate for any upper limb reconstructive procedures, including voluntary tendon or nerve transfers, or procedures to correct a problem, such as a contracture. These evaluations may already be taking place at your site's upper limb clinical practice. Participants who are candidates for such procedures and who elect to have them enter the clinical pathway of reconstruction until they are fully healed. Screening refers to evaluations that are performed specifically as a part of the GRAND trial for participants who have completed the clinical pathway for surgical reconstruction, or for participants who are either ineligible for voluntary procedures, for example, someone with a C5 Group 0 injury, or who chose not to have voluntary procedures. Screening will require informed consent by the participant. You may already have a number of participants in mind as potential candidates for the GRAND study, or you may identify prospective candidates by a review of existing tendon transfer or nerve transfer registries. The next couple of slides will provide an overview of the study flow based on different participant characteristics. The fastest pathway to GRAND enrollment will be experienced by participants who fit the inclusion criteria, have already received voluntary reconstructive procedures, and completed rehabilitation and recovery. These participants can be identified from research or clinical registries that you may already have. The next step is screening for the pivotal trial. In addition to verifying that the participant meets the inclusion criteria, compatibility of the participant's existing reconstructive surgeries needs to be assessed. Now, why would that be? Certain reconstructive procedures may negate NNP candidacy, particularly when the tendon or nerve of the recipient muscle is detached from its origin. For example, in a BR to FPL transfer, the FPL tendon is detached from its origin and the BR tendon is transferred in. That means stimulation of the FPL muscle will no longer activate thumb flexion. Similarly, an ECRL transfer to finger flexors or supinator nerve transfer for hand opening may compromise ability to stimulate hand closing and opening. Pre-existing surgeries will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nature and number of procedures performed. There's not one recipe, but a process for deciding whether past surgeries are compatible with NNP implantation. Based on successfully meeting inclusion criteria and reconstructive surgery compatibility, participants can move forward to qualification and baseline testing. If criteria are not met, however, the participant is not an NNP candidate. The pathway to GRAND trial enrollment may be longer for participants who have never been evaluated for reconstructive surgeries. Participants with no history of upper limb reconstructive surgery will be pre-screened to determine if they are a candidate for any upper limb reconstructive procedures, including voluntary tendon or nerve transfers, or procedures to correct a problem, such as a contracture. Participants who are candidates for such procedures and who elect to have them enter the clinical pathway of surgical reconstruction until they are fully healed, a process that can take 6 to 12 months, or potentially longer if nerve transfers have been performed. At that point, participants can move into the GRAND screening process we discussed on the previous slide to determine their candidacy for the NNP. Going back to pre-screening, participants who are either ineligible for voluntary procedures or those who chose not to have voluntary procedures may proceed directly to screening for the GRAND trial. These are the critical screening measures for the GRAND trial. Remember that prior to any screening activities, informed consent must be obtained from the prospective participant. We will talk more about that shortly. An expedited INSCI is performed to verify that participants' injury classification is between C1 and C7, AIS A, B, or C. Voluntary strength is assessed through a manual muscle test, and muscle excitability is tested by applying electrical stimulation and performing a stimulated manual muscle test. More about that in Module 7. While we typically don't measure joint range of motion with a goniometer in this screening, A qualitative assessment is made to ensure that range of motion is within functional limits and to rule out problematic tendon or joint tightness. A similar approach is taken to rule out any problems with sensation or spasticity that would interfere with NNP implantation or use. If these measures indicate that a participant is a candidate, then the process of qualification for enrollment begins. Qualification tests are performed to ensure that a participant is medically eligible for the NNP. These qualification tests, in combination with the screening measures we discussed on the previous slide, yield all of the information necessary to determine if a person is a candidate at that point in time. Delay between screening and implantation may mean that some of the tests are repeated to meet the study timeline and pre-surgical testing requirements. It is important that the participant understands the potential for repeated testing and also understands that a change in health status may mean ineligibility for the study. Screening and qualification testing results will be sent to the sponsor, and an enrollment confirmation meeting will be scheduled. Attendees should include the sponsor and site PIs, surgeons, and therapists. At this meeting, the screening and qualification data will be reviewed, and the candidacy confirmation checklist will be completed. Upon verification for candidacy by sponsor and site PIs, the participant will be recommended for enrollment. At this stage, the site PI will initiate the surgery or study-informed consent process. The next critical step at a later point in time is to develop the surgical plan, including identification of muscles for implantation. As with candidate confirmation, this step will be done in tandem between the sponsor and the trial site to promote an iterative learning process to help get the site up to speed with independent surgical planning. The GRAND trial uses a two-tiered consent process. A screening consent is used to streamline the initial assessment. This allows performance of screening measures without having to review potentially irrelevant information, such as surgical and other risks, before knowing whether or not someone is a candidate. The screening consent allows for all of the activities involved in screening and qualification. Upon enrollment confirmation, the site PI initiates the process of surgical consent. This consent goes into greater detail about the surgery and overall study participation. Of course, if a participant's candidacy seems promising, information about the surgery and other aspects of the study participation can be provided during the screening phase. Often, we will provide participants with the surgical consent form to take home and read in preparation for the next step. Looking at our timeline, the screening consent must be signed prior to any study activities. The surgery consent process is initiated once candidacy is confirmed and must be signed before implantation. A good time for this is at visit 1 prior to baseline assessments. Again, it's also helpful to provide the participant with a copy of the surgery consent form ahead of time, perhaps after the screening visit and candidacy confirmation. Forms associated with the content included in this learning module include the informed consent documents as well as the case report forms listed here, and will be provided by the sponsor. In conclusion, we hope that you have a good understanding of the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the GRAND pivotal trial, as well as strategies for recruiting participants, the differences between pre-screening and screening, the two-tiered consent process, and the candidate confirmation process. Congratulations! You have now completed Module 6. Next, we will swim through a deep dive on lower motor neuron assessment.